The autumn fog rolled through Redwood Hills just after dawn on October 15th, 1992, turning the manicured lawns and craftsman bungalows of Lakeview into watercolor shadows. 24-year-old Rebecca Chen locked the door of her apartment at 7:30, her nursing scrubs crisp and white, her black hair pulled into a practical ponytail. She carried a thermos of coffee and a paperback novel she'd never finish. By noon, she would be dead. Rebecca Chen had moved to Lakeview 6 months earlier, drawn by the promise of a nursing position at Mercy General Hospital and the affordable rent in a neighborhood that still felt safe in an increasingly anxious America. She'd grown up in Sacramento, the youngest of 3 daughters, born to parents who'd immigrated from Taiwan in the 1970s, with engineering degrees and relentless optimism about their adopted country. Rebecca had inherited their work ethic and their belief that good things came to those who followed the rules, studied hard, and kept their heads down. She'd graduated from nursing school in 1991 and spent her first year working night shifts in a San Francisco emergency room, saving money and dreaming of something quieter. Somewhere she could build a life that didn't revolve around trauma and adrenaline and the particular exhaustion that comes from witnessing suffering in fluorescent-lit rooms that never sleep. Redwood Hills sat on the eastern edge of Lakeview, a working-class neighborhood of single-family homes and low-rise apartment buildings where teachers and postal workers and hospital staff could still afford to live within 20 minutes of downtown. The streets were lined with redwood trees that gave the area its name, their massive trunks and sprawling canopies creating corridors of permanent shade even on the brightest days. Rebecca's apartment was a 1-bedroom unit in a 4-plex on Sycamore Street, painted pale yellow with white trim, with a small balcony where she kept potted herbs and a folding chair she used on weekends to read in whatever sunlight managed to filter through the branches overhead. Her neighbors were a retired couple who watched game shows at high volume, a divorced electrician who worked irregular hours, and a graduate student who practiced violin at times that suggested no regard for anyone else's sleep schedule. It was the kind of anonymous urban living where people nodded in passing but didn't intrude, which suited Rebecca perfectly as she adjusted to a new city and a new routine. Her shift at Mercy General ran from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, 5 days a week, working the medical surgical floor where patients recovered from procedures or managed chronic conditions that required monitoring but not intensive care. She was competent and well-liked, the kind of nurse who remembered patient names and family details, who double-checked medication dosages and never complained about extra assignments. On the morning of October 15th, she followed her usual routine, waking at 6:45, showering, dressing, grabbing the lunch she'd packed the night before, a turkey sandwich and an apple and a can of Diet Coke. She left her apartment at 7:30, descended the external stairs to the parking lot, and walked to her car, a 1987 Honda Civic in faded blue that she'd bought used and maintained meticulously. Security footage from a neighboring business would later show her unlocking the driver's door, placing her bag on the passenger seat, and pulling out of the lot at 7:33. She never arrived at work. When Rebecca failed to show up for her shift and didn't answer pages to the hospital's operator, her supervisor initially assumed car trouble or a family emergency, the kinds of ordinary disruptions that occasionally derailed even reliable employees. But by 10 o'clock, when Rebecca still hadn't called and wasn't answering her home phone, concern escalated into alarm. The hospital contacted the Lakeview Police Department to request a welfare check. Officer David Martinez drove to Rebecca's apartment at 10:45, knocked on the door, received no answer, and checked with the building manager, a woman named Dorothy Fletcher who lived in the ground floor unit and kept track of her tenants with the attention of someone who'd seen too many people skip out on rent. Dorothy confirmed that Rebecca's car wasn't in its assigned space, but agreed to unlock the apartment so Martinez could verify she wasn't inside, injured, or incapacitated. The apartment was empty and undisturbed. The bed was made, dishes were drying in the rack beside the sink, the television was off. Everything suggested someone who'd left for work, intending to return that evening. Martinez thanked Dorothy and drove back to the station, filing a report that would be upgraded to a missing person case by end of day when Rebecca's family, contacted by the hospital, confirmed they hadn't heard from her and grew frantic with the speed that comes from instinct, recognizing danger before facts confirm it. The discovery came at 4:17 that afternoon, in a location that would haunt investigators for decades. A man walking his dog in Riverside Park, a 100-acre expanse of trails and picnic areas that bordered the northern edge of Lakeview, noticed his animal pulling toward a drainage culvert that ran beneath the main path, carrying runoff from the hills above down to the creek below. The dog, a German shepherd named Rex, began barking with unusual intensity, straining at his leash and refusing to continue the walk. The owner, a retiree named Frank Holloway, initially tried to pull Rex away, annoyed by the disruption to their routine, but the dog's agitation was so extreme that Holloway finally walked closer to investigate, thinking perhaps an animal was trapped or dead inside the concrete tunnel. What he saw in the shadows of the culvert made him stumble backward, his heart lurching in his chest with the sick certainty that his afternoon had just intersected with someone else's nightmare. He saw a hand first, pale and motionless, extending from a pile of branches and debris that had been deliberately arranged to conceal what lay beneath. Holloway ran back to the parking lot, found a payphone, and dialed 911 with fingers that shook so badly he had to redial twice before getting the number right. Police and emergency services arrived within 8 minutes, securing the area and beginning the grim process of documenting a crime scene. The body was Rebecca Chen's, identified later that evening through fingerprints and the hospital ID badge still clipped to her scrubs. She'd been strangled, the medical examiner would determine, with sufficient force to fracture the hyoid bone in her throat. The attack had been brutal and efficient, suggesting either rage or experience, or both. Her body showed signs of sexual assault, confirmed through forensic examination that revealed evidence investigators hoped would eventually identify her killer, though in 1992 the science of DNA analysis was still emerging, expensive and time-consuming, and not yet the definitive tool it would become. Evidence was collected: fibers, hair samples, bodily fluids, fingernail scrapings. Everything was photographed, measured, cataloged, and stored with the care of people who understood they were building a case that would need to withstand scrutiny in a courtroom. The crime scene itself told a story that detectives worked to decode. Rebecca's car was found 3 hours later in the parking lot of a shopping center, 2 miles from Riverside Park, locked and undamaged, with her purse still inside, containing her wallet with $43 in cash and all her credit cards untouched. This wasn't robbery. Her keys were missing, never recovered despite extensive searches. The location of the body, hidden in a culvert in a park she had no known reason to visit, suggested she'd been killed elsewhere and transported, though no secondary crime scene was ever identified. The branches covering her body had been cut recently, their ends still green and oozing sap, indicating premeditation, someone who'd prepared a hiding place before or immediately after the murder. Detective Raymond Voss caught the case within 2 hours of the body's discovery. He was 41 years old, a 17-year veteran of the Lakeview Police Department, with a reputation for thoroughness and a collection of solved homicides that had earned him respect, if not affection, from colleagues who found his intensity exhausting. Voss approached the Riverside Park crime scene with the controlled focus of someone who knew the first hours determined everything, that evidence degraded and memories faded, and the chance to catch a killer diminished with each passing minute. He walked the scene slowly, observing before touching, building a mental map of where the body lay in relation to paths and roads, how visible it would have been to a killer transporting it in daylight versus darkness, what the presence of the cut branches suggested about planning and personality. He interviewed Frank Holloway, asking detailed questions about the dog's behavior, about whether he'd walked this route before, about any vehicles he might have noticed in the parking lot or people he'd seen on the trails. He coordinated with forensic technicians, making sure every photograph was taken from multiple angles. Every sample was properly labeled. Every detail was preserved for future analysis. He spoke with Rebecca's supervisor at the hospital, with her neighbors, with her family who drove from Sacramento in a fog of disbelief and arrived at the police station demanding answers that didn't yet exist. The first 48 hours of investigation operated on the assumption that whoever killed Rebecca Chen knew her, because most murders are personal, committed by intimate partners or family members or acquaintances whose relationships contain the accumulated resentments and obsessions that sometimes explode into violence. Detectives interviewed Rebecca's ex-boyfriend from nursing school, who was devastated by her death and had an ironclad alibi, working a shift at a hospital in San Francisco when she disappeared. They interviewed co-workers, patients who'd been discharged recently, Anyone whose interactions with Rebecca might have curdled into something dangerous. They found nothing. Rebecca's life was remarkably free of drama or conflict, populated by people who liked her or barely knew her, with no one expressing anything beyond shock and sadness at her death. The investigation shifted to the possibility of a stranger abduction, a predator who'd selected Rebecca randomly or based on opportunity rather than personal connection. This was more frightening in some ways, suggesting someone who might kill again, who might be hunting other victims, even as detectives worked to identify him from evidence that felt maddeningly inadequate. The Lakeview Police Department formed a task force, pulling in detectives from surrounding jurisdictions, coordinating with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to develop a profile of the killer. The profile suggested a white male in his 20s to 40s, possibly with a history of sexual offenses or violence against women, someone familiar with the Riverside Park area who'd chosen the culvert deliberately as a disposal site. It was general enough to describe thousands of men in the region and specific enough to feel tantalizingly close to useful. Tips flooded the police hotline, each one requiring follow-up and verification. A woman reported seeing a man matching the profile near the park on the morning of October 15th. 3 other witnesses reported 3 different men who also matched the profile, in different locations, at different times, each description contradicting the others in ways that made them useless. A psychic called, claiming to have visions of Rebecca's last moments, but couldn't provide any verifiable details. Rebecca's parents offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest, and the reward generated another wave of tips, mostly people reporting suspicions about neighbors or ex-husbands or vague strangers who'd looked at them wrong, none of it leading anywhere concrete. Forensic analysis provided the most promising avenue for eventual resolution. Semen recovered from Rebecca's body contained DNA that could theoretically identify her killer, but in 1992, the databases were limited. The technology was expensive, and testing took months to complete. The California Department of Justice operated a DNA databank containing profiles from convicted sex offenders, but it held only a few thousand samples, and comparison required submitting evidence and waiting for technicians to manually process results. Detective Voss submitted the samples and received results 6 weeks later, no matches. The killer either had no prior convictions or had never been arrested, which meant his DNA existed only in the evidence from this crime, waiting for a future where technology and databases expanded enough to find him. By December, 2 months after Rebecca's murder, the investigation had exhausted its most obvious leads. Detectives had interviewed over 200 people, collected evidence from dozens of locations, pursued every theory that had any plausibility. The task force was quietly dissolved, its members returned to their regular assignments, though Voss kept the case on his desk and continued working it whenever time allowed. The media coverage, intense in the first weeks, faded as newer tragedies demanded attention. Rebecca's family held a funeral in Sacramento, buried their daughter, and began the hollow process of learning to live with a loss that had no resolution. Only questions that grew more painful the longer they remained unanswered. Detective Raymond Voss spent the winter of 1992 and 1993 pursuing leads that dissolved like morning fog the moment he tried to grasp them. Every potential suspect cleared themselves through alibis or evidence, or the simple reality that suspicion without proof is just paranoia dressed in professional language. A maintenance worker at Riverside Park, who'd been fired 2 weeks before Rebecca's murder for drinking on the job, became a person of interest until investigators confirmed he'd been in detox in Oregon when she died. His presence there documented by intake forms and witnessed by a dozen fellow addicts. A registered sex offender living 4 blocks from Rebecca's apartment complex generated intense scrutiny until his electronic monitoring ankle bracelet, court-ordered from a previous conviction, placed him at home during the hours when Rebecca disappeared, the tamper-proof device recording his every movement with the impersonal precision of technology that doesn't lie or forget. The forensic evidence that had seemed so promising in October remained stubbornly uninformative despite repeated analysis. The DNA profile extracted from biological samples collected at the crime scene was complete and viable, sufficient to identify a suspect if one ever materialized, but it matched nothing in the limited databases available to law enforcement in the early 1990s. The California Department of Justice Databank contained approximately 4,000 DNA profiles from convicted offenders, a number that sounds substantial until you consider it represented a fraction of 1% of the state's population, and only included individuals convicted of specific crimes after the databank's creation in 1991. The FBI's national database was even more limited, still in its infancy, and plagued by incompatible collection standards and bureaucratic resistance from agencies unwilling to share information across jurisdictional boundaries. Hair fibers recovered from Rebecca's clothing and body proved equally frustrating. Microscopic analysis could determine they came from a Caucasian individual, but couldn't narrow identification beyond that broad category. The fibers were brown, medium length, and unremarkable in every way that mattered for investigation. Similar fibers could have come from thousands of men in the Lakeview area. Without a suspect to compare them against, they existed only as evidence waiting for context, facts without meaning. Fingerprints lifted from Rebecca's car yielded nothing useful, matching either Rebecca herself or known acquaintances who'd ridden with her in the weeks before her death, all of whom had been interviewed and cleared. Voss expanded his investigation to include a review of similar unsolved crimes within a 200-mile radius, working on the theory that Rebecca's murder might be part of a pattern, one point in a constellation of violence that would reveal itself through comparison. He spent weeks in archives pulling case files, looking for similarities in victim type, method of killing, body disposal locations. He found 3 unsolved murders that shared some characteristics. Young women attacked in Northern California between 1988 and 1992, all involving strangulation, all with evidence of sexual assault. But the differences were as significant as the similarities. One victim had been a prostitute killed in Oakland, found in an abandoned building in a neighborhood known for drug activity. Another had been a college student who disappeared from a party in Sacramento and whose body was found 3 weeks later in a rural area 50 miles from where she'd last been seen. The third was a teenager who'd been hitchhiking and was discovered in a roadside ditch in Redding. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, designed specifically to identify patterns across jurisdictions, was consulted but offered no definitive connections. The database searched for similar modus operandi, victim characteristics, and geographic proximity, but the algorithm was only as good as the data entered by participating agencies, and many jurisdictions either hadn't submitted their cases or had submitted incomplete information. The violent crime analyst who reviewed Voss's inquiry noted that while the cases shared some surface similarities, the differences in victimology and disposal sites suggested different offenders unless he was dealing with someone whose patterns changed significantly between crimes, which was possible but statistically less likely than multiple perpetrators operating independently. By spring of 1993, Voss had interviewed over 300 people connected even tangentially to Rebecca Chen or to Riverside Park. He'd compiled a list of 67 individuals who'd been in the general area on October 15th and who fit the broad profile of potential suspects. Men between the ages of 20 and 50, with some history of violence or sexual offense or suspicious behavior. Each one required investigation, verification of whereabouts, examination of backgrounds. It was exhausting work that consumed his days and invaded his sleep. The kind of case that becomes personal not because of any connection to the victim, but because failure feels like complicity, like allowing evil to succeed through inadequacy. The pressure came from multiple directions, each one legitimate and impossible to fully satisfy. Rebecca's parents called weekly, sometimes daily, asking for updates that Voss couldn't provide without admitting the investigation had stalled. They wanted justice, wanted closure, wanted to understand why their daughter had been taken from them by someone who remained nameless and unpunished. Voss felt their grief like a physical weight, heard it in his mother's voice when she tried to remain composed and failed, dissolving into tears that made him want to promise results he couldn't guarantee. His supervisor, Captain Linda Morrison, wanted results too, but for different reasons. Institutional ones about clearance rates and resource allocation, and the reality that unsolved cases damaged public confidence in law enforcement's ability to protect communities. The media coverage, intense in the immediate aftermath of Rebecca's murder, gradually diminished as months passed without arrests or dramatic developments. Local television stations that had led newscasts with updates in October and November moved the story to brief mentions by March. then stopped covering it entirely by summer, unless Rebecca's family organized vigils or press conferences, demanding renewed attention. Newspapers ran anniversary pieces, retrospectives that summarized the case without advancing it, filling column inches with the same facts reported 6 months earlier, the same quotes from Voss about ongoing investigation and commitment to finding Rebecca's killer. The public's attention, never infinite, moved on to newer tragedies, other victims, the constant churn of violence that characterized urban America in the early 1990s. Voss felt himself becoming the detective who couldn't let go, the one whose desk remained cluttered with files from a case everyone else had mentally archived. He kept Rebecca's photograph pinned to the corkboard in his office, her nursing school portrait showing a young woman with intelligent eyes and a professional smile, someone who'd followed all the rules and been murdered anyway. He reviewed witness statements looking for inconsistencies or details that might have seemed insignificant initially, but could prove crucial with additional context. He drove to Riverside Park on his days off, walking the trails where Rebecca's body had been hidden, trying to think like her killer, to understand why this location, why this method of disposal, what it revealed about someone's psychology or familiarity with the area. One thread that Voss continued pulling, despite its failure to yield immediate results, involved employees and regular visitors to Riverside Park. The park employed a staff of maintenance workers, rangers, and seasonal help who had access to the grounds at all hours and knowledge of the drainage culverts and service roads. Voss had interviewed all of them in the initial investigation, but returned to several for follow-up questioning, particularly those with any history of complaints or behavioral issues. One name that appeared repeatedly in marginal notes was Marcus Webb, a maintenance worker who'd been employed by the Park District since 1987, and who'd been mentioned by multiple co-workers as someone who made them uncomfortable, though none could articulate specific reasons beyond vague feelings and observations about how he looked at female visitors. Webb was 41 years old in 1992, divorced, living alone in a rental house on the outskirts of Lakeview. He'd served in the Army in the early 1970s, received an honorable discharge, and worked various manual labor jobs before being hired by the Park District. His duties included trail maintenance, trash collection, and minor repairs to facilities. Voss had interviewed him twice in the initial investigation, both times finding Webb cooperative if not particularly forthcoming, answering questions with minimal elaboration and maintaining that he'd been working on the western side of the park on October 15th, nowhere near the culvert where Rebecca's body was found. His timesheet from that day supported his account, showing he'd clocked in at 7 in the morning and worked until 3:30 in the afternoon, and his supervisor confirmed seeing him multiple times throughout the day. What bothered Voss, what kept bringing him back to Webb despite the absence of concrete evidence, was a complaint filed in 1989 by a female park visitor who'd reported that a maintenance worker had followed her on a trail, staying about 50 yards behind her for nearly a mile until she reached the parking lot and got in her car. She'd written down his name from the badge on his uniform, Marcus Webb. When questioned at the time, Webb claimed he'd been walking the trail as part of his duties, checking for hazards, and hadn't realized he was making the woman uncomfortable. His supervisor had given him a verbal warning about maintaining appropriate boundaries with park visitors, but no formal discipline had resulted, and the incident was filed away as a misunderstanding. Voss requested permission to search Webb's home and vehicle, but without probable cause or evidence linking him specifically to Rebecca's murder. No judge would authorize a warrant based solely on uncomfortable feelings and a 3-year-old complaint. Voss did what he could within legal boundaries, conducting surveillance when time permitted, running background checks that revealed nothing beyond the divorce and a DUI conviction from 1984. Webb's DNA wasn't on file because he'd never been convicted of crimes that required submission. Without grounds for arrest, Voss couldn't compel him to provide a sample voluntarily, and Webb declined when asked, which was his right, and which also did nothing to diminish Voss's suspicions. By autumn of 1993, 1 year after Rebecca Chen's murder, the investigation had effectively stalled. The task force had been formally dissolved months earlier, its members reassigned to newer cases that demanded attention. Voss remained the primary detective, but he carried a caseload of other investigations that required his time and energy, homicides and assaults and robberies that had to be worked regardless of his desire to focus solely on Rebecca. The case was officially classified as open but inactive, a designation that meant exactly what it sounded like. No new leads were being pursued, no active investigation was occurring. The file sat in a cabinet waiting for something to change. Rebecca's family struggled through the first anniversary of her death, with the particular anguish of people confronting the permanence of loss without resolution. Her mother, Susan Chen, had stopped working, unable to focus on anything beyond the absence of her daughter and the failure of law enforcement to identify who'd taken her. Her father, Robert Chen, threw himself into advocacy, founding a support group for families of unsolved homicide victims, channeling his grief into action because the alternative was drowning in questions that had no answers. They held a vigil at Riverside Park on October 15th, attended by approximately 200 community members who stood in the autumn darkness holding candles and listening to speeches about justice and memory and the importance of never forgetting victims whose cases remained unsolved. Voss attended the vigil, standing at the back of the crowd, feeling the weight of failure that came with seeing a family still waiting for closure he couldn't provide. He'd done everything by procedure, followed every lead, exhausted every avenue available with the technology and resources of the early 1990s. But procedure and effort didn't equal results, and results were what the Chen family needed, what Rebecca deserved, what Voss wanted to deliver more than anything in his professional life. He made a silent promise, standing in that park where Rebecca had been hidden, that he would never truly close this case, that would never stop looking for the break that might still come. The passage of time transforms even the sharpest grief into something duller and more manageable, not because pain diminishes, but because human beings adapt to carrying weights they initially believed would crush them. Susan and Robert Chen learned to navigate a world that continued spinning despite their daughter's absence, though neither of them ever fully returned to who they'd been before October 15th, 1992. Susan eventually went back to her job as a librarian, but found herself unable to concentrate on cataloging systems or patron requests, her mind drifting constantly to Rebecca, to the last conversation they'd had, to all the moments that would never happen now. She retired early at 58, spent her days volunteering with victims' advocacy groups, speaking at conferences about the unique torture of unsolved cases where families exist in permanent limbo, unable to achieve the closure that comes from knowing who and why and how. Robert threw himself into the foundation he'd created, the Rebecca Chen Memorial Fund, which provided financial assistance to families navigating the expensive aftermath of violent crime. He lobbied legislators for increased funding for cold case units, for mandatory DNA collection from convicted felons, for reforms in how law enforcement agencies shared information across jurisdictional boundaries. His advocacy was driven by the belief that Rebecca's death had to mean something beyond tragedy, had to generate some positive change that might prevent other families from experiencing what his had endured. He testified before state committees, wrote editorials, appeared on local news programs whenever the anniversary of Rebecca's murder rolled around, keeping her name alive in public consciousness, even as the investigation itself remained frozen. Detective Raymond Voss carried the case with him through the 1990s and into the 2000s, even as his career progressed and his responsibilities expanded. He made sergeant in 1995, lieutenant in 2001, each promotion bringing administrative duties that pulled him further from active investigation, but never far enough to forget the cases that haunted him. Rebecca's file sat in his office through multiple relocations, the cardboard box growing worn at the corners, the evidence logs yellowing with age, the photographs fading but still capable of triggering that familiar frustration that came from knowing he'd failed to deliver justice. He pulled the file periodically, reviewed witness statements and forensic reports, looked for patterns or connections he might have missed in earlier examinations. But the evidence never changed, and the databases never produced matches. The case was periodically revived by events that briefly renewed investigative energy before fading back into dormancy. In 1997, a woman's body was found in a park in Oakland, strangled and sexually assaulted in circumstances similar enough to Rebecca's murder that detectives from both jurisdictions coordinated to see if the crimes were connected. The Oakland victim was younger, a teenager, and the forensic evidence suggested a different perpetrator. But the investigation prompted Voss to resubmit Rebecca's DNA evidence for comparison against California's expanding database, which by then contained approximately 20,000 profiles. No matches resulted. The Oakland case was eventually solved, a conviction obtained against the victim's ex-boyfriend, and the brief flicker of hope that it might illuminate Rebecca's murder was extinguished. In 2003, advances in DNA amplification techniques allowed forensic labs to generate more complete profiles from smaller or degraded samples. The California Department of Justice contacted agencies with unsolved cases to offer reanalysis of evidence using newer methods that could potentially extract information missed by earlier technology. Voss immediately submitted Rebecca's evidence, hoping that 11 years of technological progress might reveal something useful. The reanalysis confirmed what the original testing had shown: a complete and viable DNA profile from an unknown male subject, sufficient for identification if that subject could ever be located. The profile was uploaded to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, which by 2003 contained over 1 million profiles from convicted offenders across all 50 states. The system searched for matches, comparing Rebecca's evidence against every profile in the database. No matches were found. Her killer either had never been arrested for crimes requiring DNA submission, or had committed Rebecca's murder before being entered into the system, and had since died, or left the country, or simply continued living, without ever coming to law enforcement's attention again. Marcus Webb, the park maintenance worker who generated Voss's suspicions in the initial investigation, remained employed by the park district until 2006 when he retired at age 55. Voss had kept loose surveillance on Webb over the years, checking periodically to see if he'd been arrested for other crimes or if his name appeared in connection with suspicious incidents. Nothing emerged. Webb lived quietly, worked his job, divorced and remarried, and divorced again, moved to a different rental house but stayed in the Lakeview area. Without evidence to justify more aggressive investigation, without probable cause for arrest or search warrants, Voss could only watch and wait and hope that Webb would make a mistake if he was indeed guilty. But people who successfully commit murder and evade detection for years are often careful, disciplined, aware that scrutiny might come, and prepared to maintain the facade of normalcy indefinitely. The Rebecca Chen case was officially reclassified as cold in 2008, 16 years after the murder, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that active investigation had ceased, and the file would remain dormant unless new evidence emerged. The reclassification came as part of a departmental reorganization that created a dedicated cold case unit within the Lakeview Police Department, a 3-person team responsible for reviewing unsolved homicides and sexual assaults to determine which might benefit from modern forensic techniques or fresh investigative approaches. Rebecca's case was included in the initial batch of files transferred to the unit, one of 47 unsolved murders dating back to the 1970s, each representing a person whose death remained unresolved and a family still waiting for answers. The cold case unit was led by Detective Angela Martinez, no relation to the patrol officer who'd first checked Rebecca's apartment in 1992. Martinez was 34 years old, had worked homicide for 6 years, and approached cold cases with a mixture of optimism and realism, born from understanding that technology could only accomplish so much, and that many cases remained unsolved simply because the killer was dead or otherwise beyond reach of notice. Justice. She reviewed Rebecca's file in 2009, 17 years after the murder, reading through Voss's meticulous documentation and coming away impressed by the thoroughness of the original investigation. Voss had done everything right, followed every protocol, pursued every lead. The case hadn't gone cold because of investigative failure, but because the evidence available in 1992 simply wasn't sufficient to identify a suspect from the limited databases and forensic capabilities of that era. Martinez ordered another DNA comparison against CODIS, which by 2009 contained over 7 million profiles and was adding thousands more each month as states expanded their collection requirements to include additional categories of offenders. The search returned the same result it had for 17 years: no matches. Rebecca's killer remained unidentified, his DNA profile sitting in the database like a question waiting for an answer that might never arrive. Martinez moved on to other cases in the cold case unit's queue, cases where newer evidence or witnesses had emerged, where investigative angles existed that might actually generate results rather than confirming what was already known. Lakeview itself changed during the decades following Rebecca's murder, though the transformation was gradual enough that residents experienced it as a series of small shifts rather than dramatic upheaval. The working-class neighborhood where Rebecca had rented her apartment gentrified slowly. Property values climbing as San Francisco Bay Area spillover pushed professionals and young families into communities that had once been considered marginal. The fourplex, where Rebecca had lived, was renovated in 2012, converted into condominiums that sold for prices 3 times what the entire building had been worth in 1992. Redwood Hills became desirable, featured in real estate listings as an up-and-coming area with good schools and convenient freeway access. Its history of violence mentioned only obliquely, if at all. Riverside Park remained much as it had been, the trails and picnic areas maintained by a new generation of employees who knew nothing of Rebecca Chen or the culvert where her body had been concealed. The Park District installed better lighting and security cameras in 2015, part of a safety upgrade prompted by concerns about nighttime drug activity rather than any specific memory of Rebecca's murder. The cameras were digital, recording constantly to servers that stored footage for 30 days before automatic deletion, a surveillance infrastructure that would have potentially solved Rebecca's case if it had existed in 1992, but which served no purpose now except to create the illusion of safety in a space where violence had once occurred and might occur again, despite technological oversight. Raymond Voss retired from the Lakeview Police Department in 2014 at age 63, completing a 40-year career that had encompassed hundreds of investigations and dozens of solved homicides. Rebecca Chen's case remained unsolved among his files, the one that had gotten away, the failure that overshadowed successes and reminded him that police work, no matter how dedicated or skilled, couldn't guarantee justice. He attended his retirement party, accepted the plaque and the speeches and the good-natured ribbing from colleagues, and went home to a house that felt too quiet without the purpose that had structured his adult life. He kept copies of Rebecca's case file, unofficially and probably against policy, unable to let go entirely, even though his authority to investigate had ended with his employment. The Chen family's annual vigil at Riverside Park continued through the 2000s and into the 2010s, though attendance dwindled as years passed and the community's connection to Rebecca's memory faded. The 20th anniversary in 2012 drew perhaps 50 people, mostly family and members of the victims' advocacy groups that Susan had joined. The 25th anniversary in 2017 drew fewer than 30. Susan was 73 by then, Robert 75, both of them diminished by age and grief into versions of themselves that bore little resemblance to the people they'd been before losing their daughter. They spoke at the vigil about never giving up hope, about trusting that justice would eventually come even after 25 years. But their voices carried the exhaustion of people who'd waited longer than anyone should have to wait, and who understood, though couldn't admit aloud, that Rebecca's killer might never be identified. The forensic science community experienced revolutionary advances during the 2010s that would eventually transform cold case investigation in ways that seemed impossible just a decade earlier. The development of forensic genetic genealogy, using DNA evidence to build family trees through consumer genetic databases, emerged as a technique in 2018 when investigators in California used it to identify the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who'd evaded capture for 40 years. The technique involved uploading crime scene DNA to public genealogy websites like GEDmatch, identifying distant relatives who shared genetic markers, then constructing family trees to narrow down potential suspects. It was time-consuming and required specialized expertise, but it worked when traditional database searches failed, opening cold cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable. The success of the Golden State Killer case prompted law enforcement agencies across the country to reevaluate their cold case files, identifying investigations where good DNA evidence existed but had never matched anyone in criminal databases. The technique was controversial, raising privacy concerns about using genetic information submitted for ancestry research to solve crimes. But the legal challenges were gradually resolved in favor of law enforcement use, particularly for violent crimes like murder and rape. Funding became available through grants and nonprofit organizations dedicated to resolving cold cases, providing resources to hire genetic genealogists, and pay for the extensive research required to build family trees from DNA evidence. In 2021, nearly 30 years after Rebecca Chen's murder, the Lakeview Police Department received a grant from the National Institute of Justice specifically designated for applying forensic genetic genealogy to unsolved homicides. The grant provided funding to submit up to 10 cases for analysis by Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in genetic genealogy services for law enforcement. Detective Angela Martinez, still leading the cold case unit, and now 46 years old, immediately thought of Rebecca's case when the grant was announced. The DNA evidence was strong, the original investigation had been thorough, and the family deserved resolution after 3 decades of waiting. She submitted the case file and evidence to Parabon in June 2021, beginning a process that would take months but which represented the first genuine hope for a breakthrough since 1992. The forensic genetic genealogy process that began in June 2021 operated on principles that would have seemed like science fiction to Detective Raymond Voss when he'd first investigated Rebecca Chen's murder in 1992. The DNA profile extracted from evidence collected at the crime scene, which had sat in databases for nearly 3 decades without producing a match to any known offender, became instead a roadmap to identifying relatives of the killer through shared genetic markers inherited across generations. Parabon Nanolabs received the evidence in late June and began the painstaking work of extracting and amplifying DNA suitable for upload to genealogy databases, a process complicated by the age of the samples and the degradation that occurs inevitably over time, even in properly stored evidence. The lead genealogist assigned to Rebecca's case was a woman named Dr. Jennifer Walsh, 42 years old, who'd earned her doctorate in genetics before pivoting into forensic genealogy after watching it revolutionize cold case investigation. Walsh had worked on 17 cases for law enforcement agencies, successfully identifying suspects in 11 of them, and she approached each investigation with the methodical patience of someone who understood that answers emerged from hundreds of hours, examining birth records, obituaries, census data, and the sprawling family trees that people uploaded to ancestry websites without fully understanding how that information might be used. She received Rebecca's DNA profile in July and immediately uploaded it to GEDmatch, a genealogy website that allowed law enforcement uploads for investigative purposes, and to Family Tree DNA, which offered similar access under specific legal guidelines. The initial results came back within days but required months to interpret meaningfully. The DNA profile matched numerous individuals in the databases at varying degrees of genetic relatedness, from distant cousins who shared as little as 1% of their DNA to closer relatives who shared 5 or 6%, suggesting they were second or third cousins to the unknown subject whose DNA had been recovered from Rebecca's body. Walsh began the laborious process of building family trees for each match, working backward through generations to identify common ancestors, then working forward to map all descendants of those ancestors, creating sprawling genealogical charts that included thousands of individuals across multiple generations. The goal was to find the point where all the family trees converged, to identify the ancestral couple from whom both the DNA matches and the unknown killer descended, then narrow down which specific descendant matched the age, geographic location, and characteristics consistent with being Rebecca's murderer. By September 2021, Walsh had identified a promising cluster of matches that suggested the killer descended from a couple named James and Margaret Whitmore, who'd lived in Iowa in the late 1800s and had 13 children, whose descendants had scattered across the United States through the 1900s, creating a family tree that included over 4,000 living individuals by the end of the 20th century. Walsh focused on male descendants who would have been between 20 and 50 years old in 1992 and who had some connection to Northern California, either through birth, residence, or employment. The initial pool contained 87 potential matches, far too many to investigate individually, but narrow enough that further genealogical research could eliminate most of them through age, location, or other disqualifying factors. Detective Angela Martinez received Walsh's preliminary report in early October and felt the first stirring of hope she'd experienced in years of working cold cases that rarely produced results. She coordinated with Walsh to begin eliminating candidates systematically, requesting access to driver's license records, voter registration data, and property records that could confirm or eliminate individuals based on their whereabouts in 1992. Many of the 87 candidates could be excluded immediately because they'd been living in other states or had died before Rebecca's murder, or were documented to be in locations incompatible with being in Lakeview on October 15th. By November, the list had narrowed to 23 individuals who remained viable suspects based on age, gender, and geographic proximity to Lakeview in October 1992. Martinez began background investigations on each of the 23, pulling criminal records, employment histories, and any available information about their lives and movements during the relevant time period. 17 of them had no criminal records and no obvious connections to Riverside Park or Rebecca Chen. 3 had minor criminal histories involving DUIs or misdemeanor assaults, but had been living in other parts of California in 1992. 2 had died in the intervening decades, eliminating them as current suspects, though not excluding them from historical responsibility. That left one name that made Martinez's pulse quicken when she saw it attached to a criminal background that included a 1985 arrest for assault and a 1998 conviction for stalking. Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb, now 70 years old, had been on Detective Voss's radar from the beginning of the investigation. The park maintenance worker who'd made people uncomfortable, who'd been accused of following a woman on a trail in 1989, who'd declined to provide DNA voluntarily when questioned in 1992. Martinez pulled Voss's original case files and found detailed notes about Webb, about the suspicions that had never crystallized into evidence sufficient for arrest, about surveillance that had yielded nothing actionable. She requested Webb's full criminal history from the State Department of Justice and found the stalking conviction, from 1998, had involved a woman who worked at a coffee shop Webb frequented, a woman who reported that Webb had followed her home multiple times, had appeared outside her apartment at odd hours, had left notes on her car expressing obsession and ownership. Webb had been sentenced to 6 months in county jail and 3 years probation, had completed his sentence without violations, and had lived apparently without incident since then. What Webb had never been required to do, because his conviction predated California's expansion of mandatory DNA collection to include all felonies, was submit a DNA sample to the state database. If he'd been convicted just 2 years later, his profile would have been in CODIS, and Rebecca's case would likely have been solved decades earlier. But the law in 1998 had required DNA submission only for specific sex offenses and violent crimes, and stalking hadn't qualified. Webb had slipped through a gap in the system, had remained unidentified despite being exactly the kind of offender whose DNA should have been collected and stored for comparison against unsolved crimes. Martinez contacted Dr. Walsh to confirm that Marcus Webb was indeed a descendant of James and Margaret Whitmore, and that his position in the family tree was consistent with the genetic relationships observed in the database matches. Walsh verified the connection within 48 hours, tracing Webb's lineage through his paternal grandfather back to the Whitmore family in Iowa, confirming he was precisely where the genetic genealogy analysis had predicted a suspect would be found. The genealogy didn't prove Webb's guilt, couldn't definitively place his DNA at the crime scene without direct comparison, but it established him as the overwhelmingly likely source of the DNA recovered from Rebecca's body and provided probable cause to obtain a warrant for a direct DNA sample. Martinez briefed her captain, who briefed the district attorney's office, and by mid-November 2021, they'd assembled enough evidence to present to a judge requesting a warrant for Marcus Webb's arrest and for collection of his DNA for comparison against the evidence from Rebecca Chen's murder. The warrant application detailed the genetic genealogy analysis, Webb's history of suspicious behavior and criminal convictions, his presence in Lakeview in October 1992, and his employment at Riverside Park with intimate knowledge of the area where Rebecca's body had been hidden. The judge reviewed the application for less than an hour before signing both warrants, authorizing law enforcement to arrest Webb and compel him to provide a DNA sample regardless of his willingness to cooperate. The arrest was planned for November 18, 2021, a Thursday morning selected because Webb's predictable routine, observed through renewed surveillance over the previous 2 weeks, indicated he'd be home at that time. Webb had retired from the Park District in 2006 and now lived alone in a small house on the rural outskirts of Lakeview, a property he'd purchased in 2010 using money inherited from his mother's estate. He lived on Social Security and a modest pension, spent his days watching television and making occasional trips to the grocery store or hardware store. appeared to have no close friends and minimal social contact beyond superficial interactions with neighbors who described him as quiet and forgettable, the kind of person you could live next to for years without forming any meaningful impression of his character or interior life. Martinez assembled a tactical team for the arrest, unwilling to take chances with a suspect who'd evaded capture for 29 years and who might react violently when confronted. 6 officers in tactical gear approached Webb's house at 6 in the morning, the sky still dark with November pre-dawn cold. Their vehicles parked a block away to avoid alerting him to their presence. Martinez waited in an unmarked car, her radio tuned to the tactical frequency, listening to the team leader count down the approach. They knocked on the door at 6:03. Martinez heard the knock through the radio, heard the team announce themselves as police with a warrant, heard the long silence that followed. 45 seconds passed before the door opened. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway wearing sweatpants and a faded flannel shirt, his gray hair disheveled from sleep, his face showing confusion that shifted into something else when he saw the tactical officers with their weapons drawn. He didn't resist, didn't run, didn't ask what this was about. He simply raised his hands above his head and allowed officers to handcuff him, allowed them to lead him to a patrol car, his expression blank in the way of someone who'd been expecting this moment for so long that its arrival brought relief rather than panic. Martinez watched from her car as Webb was placed in the back seat, and she saw in his face the look of a man who'd been waiting 29 years for the knock on the door that had finally come. Webb was transported to the Lakeview Police Department and processed through booking, photographed and fingerprinted, and asked routine questions about emergency contacts and medical conditions. He declined to speak without an attorney present, which was his right and which Martinez had expected. A public defender was contacted and arrived by 9 in the morning, a young woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to Rebecca, who met privately with Webb for 30 minutes before emerging to inform Martinez that her client would not be answering any questions or providing any statements at this time. Martinez had anticipated this as well and didn't push for an interview. The DNA sample was what mattered, and that didn't require Webb's cooperation beyond physical presence. A forensic technician collected buccal swabs from Webb's mouth at 9:45, scraping cells from the inside of his cheeks and sealing them in sterile containers that would be transported to the California Department of Justice Crime Lab for analysis. The comparison process would take several weeks minimum, longer if the lab was backed up with other cases, but Martinez was willing to wait. She'd waited 29 years for this moment, had worked a case that predated her own career in law enforcement, and she could wait a few more weeks for scientific confirmation of what genetic genealogy had already strongly suggested. Webb was held without bail, pending arraignment, charged preliminarily with murder and sexual assault based on the evidence already in hand, with the understanding that the charges would be formalized once DNA comparison confirmed his identity as the source of biological evidence from Rebecca's crime scene. News of the arrest reached Rebecca's family through a phone call Martinez made personally on November 18th, hours after Webb had been taken into custody. Susan Chen was 81 years old, Robert 83, both of them living in the same Sacramento house where they'd raised Rebecca and her sisters. Martinez drove to Sacramento to deliver the news in person, unwilling to reduce 29 years of waiting to a phone call or email. She sat in their living room, surrounded by photographs of Rebecca at various ages, and explained about genetic genealogy and family trees, and how technology had finally caught up to a killer who'd hidden for 3 decades. Susan cried, but they were different tears than Martinez had seen families shed before. Not grief exactly, but something closer to exhaustion mixed with vindication, the release that comes from having the worst thing confirmed after years of not knowing whether to hope or mourn. Robert asked questions Martinez couldn't yet answer, about trial dates and evidence and whether Webb would confess now that he'd been caught. Martinez was honest about the uncertainties, about how legal proceedings would unfold over months or years, about how even with DNA evidence conviction wasn't guaranteed if defense attorneys could raise reasonable doubt about chain of custody or contamination, or any of the technical challenges that complicated cold case prosecutions. But she was also honest about her confidence that they had the right person, that Webb's DNA would match the evidence, that justice delayed for 29 years was finally within reach. She stayed for 2 hours, answering every question, accepting their gratitude and their grief, bearing witness to the complicated emotions that came with resolution to a tragedy that had defined their lives for nearly 3 decades. The DNA comparison results arrived on January 14, 2022, almost 2 months after Webb's arrest. Martinez received the call from the crime lab at 10 in the morning, the forensic analyst's voice professionally neutral, as she delivered results that Martinez had been anticipating, but which still sent adrenaline flooding through her system when confirmed. The DNA profile from Marcus Webb's buccal swabs matched the DNA profile recovered from Rebecca Chen's body in October 1992. The probability of the match occurring by chance was less than 1 in 1 trillion, a statistical certainty that would satisfy any courtroom standard. Marcus Webb was definitively, scientifically, undeniably Rebecca Chen's killer, identified through genetic genealogy and confirmed through direct comparison 29 years after he'd strangled her and hidden her body in a drainage culvert at Riverside Park. The formal charging of Marcus Webb occurred at his arraignment on January 20, 2022, in a Lakeview courtroom packed with media, victims' advocates, and members of the Chen family who'd traveled from Sacramento to witness the moment they'd waited 29 years to see. Webb appeared in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles, his face carrying the same blank expression he'd worn since his arrest, as though he'd retreated somewhere interior where consequences couldn't reach him. The judge, a woman named Patricia Delgado, who'd been practicing law for 35 years and had presided over countless arraignments, read the charges with measured gravity. 1 count of first-degree murder with special circumstances, 2 counts of forcible rape, 1 count of kidnapping. Each charge carried potential sentences that, stacked consecutively, meant Webb would die in prison regardless of whether the state sought the death penalty. Webb's public defender entered a plea of not guilty, a procedural formality that surprised no one since trials required evidence to be presented and tested regardless of how overwhelming that evidence appeared. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Michael Brennan, outlined the case against Webb in broad strokes, DNA evidence placing him definitively at the scene. His employment at Riverside Park providing access and knowledge of the area where Rebecca's body was concealed, his history of stalking and predatory behavior toward women, and his refusal to provide DNA when questioned in 1992, suggesting consciousness of guilt. The judge set trial for September 2022, 8 months away, providing both sides time to prepare for what would likely be a lengthy proceeding despite the apparent strength of the prosecution's case. The arrest shocked the Lakeview community in ways that residents struggled to articulate when interviewed by media outlets that descended on the city, seeking reaction to a cold case solved after 3 decades. Webb had lived among them for 40 years, had worked at a public park where families brought children, had been seen at grocery stores and gas stations and hardware stores, an ordinary presence in ordinary places, indistinguishable from thousands of other middle-aged and elderly men who populated suburban California. That he'd been carrying the secret of Rebecca Chen's murder for 29 years, that he'd successfully maintained a facade of normalcy while knowing what he'd done, generated a particular species of horror rooted in the recognition that evil rarely announces itself, but instead wears unremarkable faces and lives unremarkable lives until the moment when masks slip and truth emerges. Neighbors who'd lived near Webb expressed shock tinged with retrospective unease, suddenly remembering interactions that had seemed innocuous at the time, but which now felt sinister in light of what they'd learned. A woman who'd lived 3 houses down mentioned that Webb had always watched a little too long when she walked past his property, that he'd sometimes been standing in his driveway or yard when she left for work in the morning, as though waiting to see her. A couple who'd bought the house next to Webb's in 2015 said he'd never been friendly, had responded to neighborly overtures with minimal engagement, had kept his blinds drawn and his property maintained, but empty of the personalizing details that suggested someone actually lived there rather than merely occupied space. None of these observations constituted evidence of anything beyond social awkwardness, but they accumulated into a portrait of someone who'd deliberately kept distance between himself and others, who'd understood that intimacy created vulnerability and that remaining forgettable was the best camouflage. The search warrant executed on Webb's property on the day of his arrest produced evidence that complicated the portrait of someone who'd successfully moved beyond his crime. Detectives found, hidden in a locked toolbox in Webb's garage, a collection of items that appeared to be trophies, newspaper clippings about Rebecca's murder and the investigation that followed. Her obituary carefully cut from the Sacramento Bee and preserved in a plastic sleeve. and a small leather journal containing handwritten entries that began in November 1992 and continued sporadically through the decades. The journal was coded, using abbreviations and initials rather than names, but forensic linguists and investigators who reviewed it identified entries that corresponded to significant dates in the Rebecca Chen case, including the anniversaries of her death and notations about news coverage or family vigils. The entries suggested someone who'd remained preoccupied with his crime, who'd returned to it mentally and emotionally over years, who'd been unable or unwilling to simply forget and move forward. More disturbing were references in the journal to other women, entries describing observations of their routines and movements, details about where they lived and worked, and what time they left their homes in the morning. Investigators cross-referenced these entries with unsolved cases in Northern California, dating from the mid-1990s through the 2010s, looking for patterns or victims whose disappearances or assaults might correspond to Webb's notations. Two cases emerged as particularly concerning: a 1998 rape in Oakland that had never been solved, and a 2004 sexual assault in Contra Costa County, where the victim had survived but had been unable to identify her attacker. DNA evidence from both cases had been preserved, and investigators immediately submitted it for comparison against Webb's profile. The results came back within 3 weeks. Webb's DNA matched the Oakland case, definitively linking him to a second rape that had remained unsolved for 24 years. The Contra Costa case showed no match, though that didn't exclude Webb's involvement if he'd used protection or if evidence collection had been incomplete. The revelation that Webb had likely committed at least one additional sexual assault, possibly more, transformed the prosecution's strategy and the community's understanding of what they were confronting. This wasn't a single act of violence born from unique circumstances or temporary loss of control, but a pattern of predatory behavior spanning decades, suggesting Webb was a serial offender who'd successfully evaded detection through a combination of caution, luck, and the limitations of technology available during most of his criminal career. The Alameda County District Attorney's Office filed charges against Webb for the 1998 Oakland rape, creating parallel prosecutions that would need to be coordinated to avoid double jeopardy issues, while ensuring he faced accountability for all identified crimes. Webb's attorney, Sarah Chen, found herself representing a client who generated visceral disgust even among public defenders accustomed to defending people accused of terrible acts. She did her job with professional competence, filing motions to suppress evidence and challenge the admissibility of genetic genealogy techniques, arguing that using consumer DNA databases for law enforcement purposes violated privacy expectations and created constitutional issues around unreasonable search. The motions were denied. Courts had consistently upheld the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations, particularly for serious violent crimes, finding that individuals who uploaded DNA to public databases had no reasonable expectation of privacy regarding information they'd voluntarily made available. Chen's other arguments, about chain of custody for 29-year-old evidence and about the reliability of DNA analysis performed on degraded samples, were similarly rejected by judges who found the forensic science sound and the evidence properly maintained. By July 2022, facing overwhelming evidence and the likelihood of convictions that would result in life sentences without possibility of parole, Webb's attorney approached the district attorney's office about a possible plea agreement. Webb was willing to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for concurrent rather than consecutive sentences and for being spared the death penalty, which the prosecution had not yet officially decided whether to seek. The negotiations were complicated by the involvement of two district attorneys' offices and by the Chen family's input, which the prosecution was ethically and legally obligated to consider. Susan and Robert Chen, consulted about their preferences, expressed conflicting desires. Susan wanted Webb to face trial, to be forced to sit through testimony about Rebecca's life and death, to hear the evidence detailed in open court, where his guilt would be established beyond any possible doubt. Robert wanted finality, wanted to avoid the years of appeals and retrials that sometimes followed death penalty cases, wanted the certainty that Webb would die in prison without generating additional trauma through prolonged legal proceedings. The district attorneys ultimately decided to accept a plea agreement, prioritizing certainty over the uncertainties of trial and the years of appeals that would follow any death penalty verdict. Webb pleaded guilty on August 9, 2022, to first-degree murder, 2 counts of rape and kidnapping in Rebecca's case, and to 1 count of rape in the Oakland case. The plea hearing lasted 40 minutes, during which Webb spoke only to confirm his understanding of the charges and to state guilty in response to each count. He offered no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the suffering he'd caused beyond the legal minimum required by the plea process. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for September 15th, providing time for victim impact statements and for the preparation of a probation report that would inform the court's decision about whether sentences would run concurrently or consecutively. The sentencing hearing drew an even larger crowd than the arraignment, with overflow seating established in an adjacent courtroom where proceedings were broadcast via closed-circuit television. Susan Chen delivered a victim impact statement that lasted 12 minutes, her voice steady despite tears, describing Rebecca as a daughter and sister and friend whose murder had destroyed not just one life, but had reverberated through decades, shattering her family and stealing futures that should have been filled with grandchildren and holidays and ordinary moments of joy. She spoke directly to Webb, telling him that he'd taken everything from Rebecca but had failed to erase her memory, that Rebecca lived on in the foundation that bore her name and in the advocacy work that had resulted from her death, that his cowardice in hiding for 29 years had only delayed justice but hadn't prevented it. Robert Chen spoke more briefly. His statement focused less on emotion and more on the systemic failures that had allowed Webb to evade capture for decades, calling for reforms in DNA collection policies and for increased funding for cold case investigations so that other families wouldn't have to wait 3 decades for resolution. Judge Delgado sentenced Marcus Webb to life in prison without possibility of parole for Rebecca's murder, plus additional consecutive sentences, totaling 45 years for the other charges, ensuring he would never experience freedom again regardless of how long he lived. She noted in her sentencing statement that Webb's age, 70 years old, did not mitigate the severity of his crimes or warrant any consideration of mercy, that he'd enjoyed 29 years of freedom that Rebecca had been denied, and that the remainder of his life would be spent in recognition of the debt he owed to his victims and to society. Webb was remanded to custody and transported to California State Prison, where he would serve his sentence in administrative segregation, separated from the general population, both for his protection and because inmates who victimize women are targeted for violence by other prisoners who maintain their own hierarchies of acceptable and unacceptable crimes. The resolution of Rebecca Chen's murder after 29 years generated ripples that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved, influencing policy and practice in ways that would affect cold case investigations throughout California and beyond. The successful use of forensic genetic genealogy to identify Marcus Webb prompted increased funding for cold case units statewide, with legislation passed in 2023 allocating $15 million specifically for DNA analysis and genealogical research on unsolved homicides and sexual assaults. The funding recognized that technology had created opportunities to solve cases that had seemed permanently closed, but that resources were required to actually apply those technologies to the thousands of cold cases gathering dust in evidence rooms across the state. Susan Chen lived to see Marcus Webb convicted but died in April 2023 at age 82, her health having declined rapidly after the sentencing hearing, as though the resolution she'd fought for had been the only thing keeping her alive, and once achieved allowed her body to finally rest. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched through her advocacy work, families of other victims who'd drawn strength from her refusal to accept that some questions would never be answered. Robert Chen survived her by 16 months, dying in August 2024 at 84, having devoted the final years of his life to ensuring the Rebecca Chen Memorial Fund would continue operating after his death, establishing an endowment that would fund cold case investigations and victim support services in perpetuity. Detective Angela Martinez continued working cold cases, applying genetic genealogy techniques to other unsolved murders and generating resolutions in 3 additional investigations between 2022 and 2024. She testified at conferences and training seminars about the Rebecca Chen case, using it as an example of how persistence and technology could intersect to deliver justice decades after crimes occurred, emphasizing that cold cases were never truly hopeless as long as evidence existed and investigators remained willing to pursue them. Raymond Voss, the original detective who'd worked Rebecca's case in 1992, lived long enough to learn of Webb's arrest and conviction, dying in November 2022 at age 71 from complications of lung cancer. Martinez visited him in hospice care 2 weeks before his death and told him that his investigation had been sound, that his suspicions about Webb had been correct, that the only thing preventing resolution in 1992 had been technology that didn't yet exist, not any failure of detective work. Redwood Hills and Lakeview absorbed the resolution of Rebecca's murder into the neighborhood's collective memory, a tragedy finally concluded, but never forgotten. Riverside Park installed a memorial bench near the drainage culvert where Rebecca's body had been hidden, a simple wooden structure with a bronze plaque bearing her name and dates of birth and death, offering visitors a place to sit and remember that violence can occur anywhere and that safety is always more fragile than we want to believe. The park sees fewer visitors than it once did, the area having developed in ways that created more convenient recreational spaces closer to residential centers. But those who do walk the trails sometimes stop at Rebecca's bench and read the plaque and consider the 3 decades that elapsed between her death and justice. Marcus Webb remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence with no possibility of release, no chance of redemption or rehabilitation that matters beyond his own internal state. He's now 73 years old, housed in a cell that measures 8 feet by 10 feet, spending 23 hours per day in isolation because his crimes and his age make him vulnerable to attack in general population. Whether he experiences remorse or simply regret at being caught is unknowable, as he's declined all interview requests from journalists and true crime researchers interested in understanding the psychology of someone who could murder a young woman and then live normally for 29 years. Perhaps there's nothing to understand, no profound insight into evil that would make it comprehensible rather than simply horrifying. Perhaps some people are simply willing to cause suffering for their own gratification and are capable of carrying that knowledge without it destroying them from inside. 3 decades separate the morning Rebecca Chen locked her apartment door for the last time from the resolution that finally named her killer and brought something resembling justice to a family that had waited longer than anyone should. You have to wait. The story of her murder is one of institutional persistence intersecting with technological revolution, of a case that remained cold, not because investigators failed, but because the tools required to solve it simply didn't exist in 1992. Genetic genealogy transformed cold case investigation in ways that seemed impossible just years before Rebecca's case was resolved, turning DNA from unknown offenders into roadmaps, leading back through generations to identify individuals who thought they'd successfully hidden in the anonymity of time and geography. The resolution brings Susan and Robert Chen peace, though whether that peace constitutes healing or simply the ending of unbearable uncertainty remains an open question that each family of unsolved homicide victims must answer for themselves. They died knowing who killed their daughter and why, understanding that Marcus Webb selected Rebecca not for any reason connected to who she was, but simply because she'd been available and vulnerable, a young woman alone in a world where predators recognize opportunity and act on it. That knowledge is terrible in its banality, in its refusal to provide meaning or narrative that might make sense of senseless violence. Redwood Hills endures as neighborhoods do, absorbing tragedy and moving forward because the alternative is stagnation and grief. The families who live there now mostly don't know about Rebecca Chen or about the cold case that defined the community for 3 decades. They're writing their own stories, creating their own memories, living in a place where violence occurred but doesn't define every moment. The redwood trees that gave the neighborhood its name still line the streets, still provide shade and beauty, still stand as they did in October 1992 when everything changed. Nature doesn't remember human tragedy, but people do. And somewhere in the remembering is the determination that victims like Rebecca won't be forgotten, that justice delayed isn't justice denied, that 30 years is too long to wait, but still better than never receiving answers at all.